thank you very much for coming along to what I hope will be a very lively talk on the subject of the art and soul of the city. I'm Jan Daly. I'm the arts editor of the Financial Times, based in London. And our panellists today, starting from that end, are Lu Shun, who is the creator of the Shifang Museum of Art, Brendan Cormier, who is lead curator at the V&A, Hugh Dutton, who is an architect. His firm, Hugh Dutton Associés, is based in Paris, although he works all over the world, and Hans Ulrich Obrist from the Serpentine Gallery in London, probably no stranger to many of you. We've got masses to say. These are huge questions. You'll see on your leaflet that we are invited to talk about whether culture, art, and architecture can act as social transformation, lead to social cohesion, change the face of our metropolises, and generally improve our lives for the better. So these are really enormous questions. And to address them, each of our panelists, or to begin to address them, each of our panelists has prepared a short something or other, I don't know yet, we'll see, about their work, particularly focusing on one part of the world or one theme, preferably one city that they know well, so that we have a way of kind of getting a little bit of traction on these big questions. So we'll have a look at those. Each will give just a few minutes of presentation, and then we will discuss amongst ourselves, and then there'll be lots of time for your question to the panel. So, what's our order? I think, Brendan, you're first up, only alphabetically.
Okay. I guess some images will show up at some point, but I'll just start talking. Jen told us to pick one city, so it's very clear for me that I'm working on a project right now at the V&A to open a new V&A gallery in Shenzhen, so just across the border, just around the corner. And I've been working on that project for the last 2 years, which is exciting. I think it's interesting that a museum itself, what can art and design do for the city? I come from a background, the V&A, which instrumentalizes the museum and the showing of art and design as something that can do something positively for a city, for a public, for manufacturers. So we did a very small project I'll tell you quickly about in Shenzhen in the lead up to the opening of the museum later this year. The museum is called Design Society. Called Unidentified Acts of Design, and quite simply we wanted to look at Shenzhen and as a design city, but define design on the terms of Shenzhen. So instead of taking a prepackaged term of what design is, instead try and understand how Shenzhen itself in its own unique way does design. And to look at that, you have to look really at their vast manufacturing landscape. If you look only at design studios per se, you see a city that's a relatively okay design city, but not phenomenal. And we're looking at ways to make a city exceptional in its own right. So this is the Huaqiangbei Electronics Market, where you have lots of, let's say, design talent in the form of people who can hack into a phone and turn it into a walkie-talkie, or turn a microphone into a portable karaoke machine. So there's lots of interesting things going on there. That we normally wouldn't call design, but in fact there's a lot of creativity happening. So essentially this project we looked at 8 different stories. This is a knitwear sampling factory where you have technicians working on translating designs. This is a guy who started his own DIY robotics company. And so this is WeChat, of course. We're looking at WeChat as a design phenomenon. And I think it's an interesting way to kind of reverse engineer the term design to make it fit a city, and then have that help then lead the path or define what one might do as a design city in the future, let's say. Is that a good intro?
Yes, I think that sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
You can all see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We can't, but that doesn't really matter. Hugh, I think you're next, please.
Yes, hello, thank you, Jen. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll talk about something very different. It's when it appears. First of all, I've designed the lounge here for Swire Properties. It's been a pleasure to work with Swire. Another wonderful opportunity I had with Swire was to work on the Brickell City Centre in Miami. Is it? It's on? It's on? It's okay? Okay. Oh, sorry, I got a little voice. Okay. It's in downtown Miami. That's the site before the intervention. It was just, I remember it as an open, featureless landscape with just cars, no pedestrian life whatsoever. And Swire's intervention, on which I had the opportunity of working. So can you give the next slide? Okay. Oops, what have I done? It's gone. Did I turn it off? There we go. Sorry, they made this massive intervention in downtown Miami, which was primarily just office buildings and housing. And the Swire project was very bold, bringing mixed-use commercial shopping, F&B, cinemas, cultural activities. And the project is, it's by Architectonica, and we were employed to do a roof over a street, which I'll show later. So there's two very big towers of apartment buildings, a hotel, and smaller office buildings on 3 or 4 levels of retail. So what Bernardo Fortbrescia of Architectonica's idea was to fuse together 3 city blocks with an elevated pedestrian street. So in so doing, tying 3 city blocks together and bringing in the pedestrian activity that goes with it. But he also had this idea of creating a microclimate and we were very honored to be asked by Swire and Bernardo to do this. The blue portion is the climate ribbon. And what it is it's a glass shelter, but because the development spans 3 city blocks, they weren't allowed to put facades and glass, facades in it. So it had to be open air. So the challenge of having an open air shopping street sheltered in Miami is quite a challenge because of the heat and the sun. So the project simply is a response to creating this microclimate. We formed the roof to capture the breezes off the harbor, and we used sun studies to create a sort of a fluid movement of sunshades. From my view, also symbolize the environment because with the fluidity and the way that they tie in together in complementary contrast to the buildings. So it's creating. It also has this dimension of ecology, sustainability, and I was very honored when the client said, "Well, it's a piece of art too." So, I think it becomes what's happened is it's become a point of appeal, a point of attraction, and many people come to it. On one of the opening days, Kieran said, "Everybody's taking pictures; they're not shopping." So I think the point is that if you create a focus and you create a public street in the middle of a city like Miami, I think that is a positive cultural gesture to improving the environment in the city. So I'll pass.
Thank you. I think it's on. I think it's on.
Yes, can I have the remote control? Thanks. All right, so I am background is a real estate developer, and on the side I collect contemporary art. So 10 years ago, we were giving a piece of land outside of Nanjing to develop. We thought the best way to develop the land was to commission architects, different architects from around the world, or the best ones, to each one taking a piece of land and to do a piece of architecture. So I have a lot of pictures, so I'll just go through. So this, each building has its own function. This one is a contemporary art museum, which we inaugurated in 2013, has been running a continuous program. Liu Jiakun, who did the hotel, is one of the best Chinese architects in his 50s. Some aerial photos. Gary Chen, Hirota Izuzaki, one of the most influential Japanese architects, did the conference center. I'm just going to quickly go through. Arturo Sosa's one of his biggest architectural projects before he passed away in 2007. This one is close to completion this year. Zhou Kai, who's based in Tianjin. Sana, who's based in Japan, got Pritzker Prize in 2010, and Venice Biennial curator in 2011. I'm commissioning 3 artists to work alongside their architects so that the artworks are embedded in the architecture. So it will be finished end of this year. Zhang Lei is a local Nanjing architect. He teaches at Nanjing University. Matthias Klotz is an amazing architect from from Chile. One of the best architects for house design, private house. And David Ajay, who did this amazing half artist studio, half living space, so that a lot of artists come to do residences while they can invite their friends and family to entertain them at the other living compound. Spanish architect. Australian architect. The photo doesn't do it justice. One of my favorite building, actually. French architect. Liu Hen, who's based in Shenzhen. Philip Yuan, who's based in Shanghai. Wang Shu, who's based in Hangzhou, who got Pritzker Prize in 2015. One of the first Chinese architects to ever receive that honor. Combines modernism with traditional Chinese techniques and concepts. Beautiful building. Ai Weiwei, who did this Donald Judd-ish 6 cubes, and then he smartly moved 4 cubes on the side to create an entrance, and then he did 1 slash on the back and 1 slash at the front to give it a little bit of change, so it doesn't look too much like a Donald Judd. But it's a great building, very simple. Yeah. Yonghu Chang, who recently left MIT. Cui Kai from Beijing. Alberto Kalach, very, very good architect from Mexico. Beautiful building. A very, very cool duo, actually a couple from Finland. Designed this building with patinated copper on the outside. So I also do a lot of artist commissions. I just go through them very quickly. Gabriel Lester, Xu Zhen's garden, which is right outside the museum. Itakasone sculpture, a 40-meter long sculpture, snow leopard on the grass. So it's like a gathering ground for people who come to visit the museum. We had a bonfire party last month. Very quickly go through the pictures. A performative piece done by a Chinese artist. This is a permanent installation by a conceptual artist Liu Wei. Zheng Guogu, Wang Wei, who did this beautiful piece in the mountain, made of interior material, mosaic. People use it to gather and have fun camping. Yeah, okay. That's it.
This is an extraordinary tour de force. Congratulations. Extraordinary. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very, very happy to be here, and of course, very delighted about this partnership between Swire Properties and the Serpentine Gallery, which brings us to the topic here, because we actually have this architecture art collaboration with the Zaha Hadid exhibition, which we inaugurated last Friday here in Hong Kong. And of course, that has a lot to do with art and soul of the city, because if we look at Zaha's project for Hong Kong, the Peak is an extraordinary way actually of dealing with this topic. And Zaha Hadid is very instrumental for the Serpentine. She was for more than 20 years a trustee. She started with Julia Peyton-Jones in 2000, the pavilion scheme. We did another pavilion with her 2007. Our permanent building is by her. And I thought in terms of the topic here, you know, I talk a little bit about the pavilions, because in a way, the Serpentine Pavilion have a lot to do with cosmopolitan vitality and the question if art and architecture can be a catalyst for transformation. And we believe that this structure, which happens every summer in Kensington Gardens, here is the Rem Koolhaas Pavilion, here the first one by Zaha, here Sue Fujimoto, Smiljan Radic, Sel Gascano, and Bjarke Ingels from Big. We believe that this structure has a very much transformatory kind of capacity. And I wanted to tell you a story which I think is somehow related to the question we're addressing here today. About a year ago, a taxi driver dropped me in Kensington Gardens early one morning. And the driver, because it was 7:30 a.m., assumed I must have some involvement with the gallery. So he asked me, if I was working there. So I explained to him, about what we are doing, and etc., etc. And he said he wanted to tell me the story of his daughter. So when we had the Selgas Kano Pavilion the year before with this very colorful, pavilion, he said his daughter actually dragged the family into the pavilion, and he said he would never ever think that an art or architecture exhibition would be for him. It's kind of interesting. So there's this threshold, right? And but the daughter ran into it and tried to go and fetch her. So against his will, he found himself in this pavilion. And he said it was an extraordinary thing, because ever since this happened, the daughter would talk about nothing else. She would be transformed and would talk about nothing else but architecture, would read books about architecture, most likely wants to build cities for the future, wants to make the world a better place. And in a way, I think that is an answer to this question. The answer is very simple. It's yes. Yes, architecture and art can be, an amazing catalyst. I think the question we need to ask ourselves is that we remove these thresholds. For this very reason, of course, free admission is absolutely key. Free admission, because if we had only charged £1, this daughter's life would not have been changed, because she would never have made this experience. So the idea, particularly in a society of ever-increased inequality, free admission is absolutely key. Gilbert and George say, art for all. We say architecture for all. The pavilions happen every summer, are visited by approximately 200,000 visitors, so they're visited, by more people than the Architecture Biennale in Venice. It's a truly very public platform, and we believe the same thing is true for art, this idea really of access. We are working this year with Francis Carey. Jana Peel and I, together with our teams, injected a new system that we actually, it's not a competition, but we are asking several offices to make suggestions, so that we basically then, together with our advisors, actually David Adje, whom you mentioned in your previous speech, and Richard Rogers, then can make a selection. Together we chose this scheme for the first time ever in the Serpentine Gallery's history. It will be an African pavilion. The extraordinary architect Francis Carey, who grew up in a village in Burkina Faso, then came to study in Germany, and has from the very, very beginning been interested in architecture as building community. And I think he's very relevant for the question here today, because his architecture is a catalyst for social transformation. He built schools together with the German artist Christoph Schlingensief. He built an entire village in Burkina Faso to transform society. You could say it's almost like a social sculpture in a Joseph Beuys, kind of sense. So he is the perfect architect for such a transformatory experience. He will make also a pavilion which will involve the audience in terms of participation. There will be, for the first time, not only our park nights where we invite artists and architects to do events in the pavilion, but there will be a lot of community groups taking over the pavilion. So we will give the pavilion every week to groups who can self-organize their event and use the pavilion of Francis Carey as a kind of a community building tool.
Well, thank you so much, all of you. What a fantastic range of projects. Very, very impressive. I think that I don't think that our question is much of a question, as Hans already said. I think we all already think that the answer is yes, and we probably wouldn't be here if we didn't. So maybe we can find somebody who can argue the opposite, but good luck with that. We know that this can happen and does happen. So I suppose the question we're really asking ourselves is how, and how best it can happen. I think there are elements, one of them actually everybody brought up, but Hans Ulrich in particular, the question of access. It isn't about the fact of art and culture and good architecture existing in our cities. It's about public and free access to it. And I think there's another element too, which is time. It's about how time plays a part. About. Oh, all right. I will. I'll keep going. So I think that it. Yeah, I'm going to try. Okay. Right, you want it in French next? We'll do French. We could do French. Yes. I'm sorry. That kind of put me off my stride. What was I saying? Oh yes, about time. I think it's about the growth of our cities as well as about the fact, and it's all very well building things. They have to embed themselves. We have to then assess them. So I think I might sort of jump ahead a little bit and ask you each, not just about your projects and what you want from them and what you expect from them, but also how you're going to see over time how well that's working. Brendan, is this something that you've had time to think about yet, or is the project too new?
Okay.
Well, how are you going to assess this project? I mean, the transformational value is something that we all believe in, and we work hard for it, and we design it in at the beginning. But then, does it work? Because they don't all work.
Well, I mean, first I might try and nuance that kind of our united acceptance that arts and architecture has a transformative power. Maybe I'll even expand it and say, I mean, I come from an architecture background. Every building kind of has a transformative power. Every building conditions a person. There's a whole set of signs and signifiers that tell you which way to go, how to enter. So every day we're negotiating with architecture and being conditioned by architecture. So the very architecture around us is already transforming in a certain way. So when we talk about projects about making architecture that has transformational power, we're talking about creating exceptional spaces. So exceptions to the transformations that are already ongoing. And so if the goal is to create exceptional spaces, I wonder how, once you make them mainstream, let's say, I mean, I wonder what the goal is. You can have minor kind of exceptions, but then when the exception becomes the rule, does it become something we talk about in general in a space like this? I would say quickly about working in Shenzhen. I mean, the big goal with Design Society, the new museum there, is to help and develop a design culture that already exists. And I think I would feel that I've succeeded, or our team has succeeded in a small part, if simply people start to realize and seek out what the larger design assets that already exist in the city are. and things change so fast. It's hard for me to really make up a goal. So when we first started the project, we were very much into maker spaces. There were interesting spaces, and there were a few young startups making maker spaces. And then the premier visited one of them and announced that maker spaces were, a significant part of the platform for innovation in China. And since then, you've seen thousands of maker spaces open up. So I feel, in terms of the question of transformation and goals and achieving. In China, everything moves so fast, one has to reorient their goals as it happens.
So there you almost, not overtaken, but you gave an example of something and then it mushroomed, which is brilliant. I mean, that couldn't be better, really.
Or how do you control transformation in a country that is constantly transforming? I mean, you're just kind of going along with the ride in a certain degree.
Well, I suppose, and also directing it a little bit. Sean, tell us about access to your amazing-looking. I mean, you call it a museum, but it's much more than a museum. It's like it's a sort of town, really. Do the artists and the people your visitors, do they come by invitation? Do they apply? How does it work?
Anyone can visit for a small fee of 20 RMB, which is like $3. And we do guided tours of inside of architecture. We don't really have the manpower to have them go inside the architecture yet. The architecture are used for specific events, artists, and for short-term rentals at the moment. We're now setting up the whole site to be a more like a recreational destination with art, good food, the great amenities that people can enjoy as a holistic experience. But on top of that is great architecture, beautiful spaces to look at. They can experience art firsthand. A lot of these are large-scale outdoor works where they can be immersed and enjoy. Yep.
And where do your visitors come from? From Nanjing? Or and of course from much further afield, but
there are
the majority of the population would be from there?
Majority, of course, the audience that we want to develop is the Nanjing local audience. We've got people coming in from around the world to see us, but most likely that they have an idea of what they're expecting. So they either read about us or they know about us, so they come to visit us with a special intention. But what we want to do is want to educate the people in the surrounding city, in the surrounding area, to come experience. And it's something that a lot of these people, we get asked the question the most is why would anybody do something like this? So I don't know how well that's understood in the West, but in China, a lot of the mentalities are very different. A lot of people have never seen anything like this, aside from even why would the intention behind it. And also, because all the Chinese cities, we don't actually have the habit of using great architects. We normally just hire a school architecture firm or something to do most. So all the cities in China look practically the same after the communists took over. And of course, we had great architects before that in the nationalist times. But in modern times, people are kind of brainwashed to accept that. And for something like this, to kind of just drop into in Nanjing, and it's quite shocking to a lot of people, especially the local people there. And I think it's great to engage and for them to ask questions, and then it's a great starting point for them to go on and trying to understand. Of course, a lot of students come and small kids come, and they hopefully, like Hans was saying, that might enhance and influence them in the future. Yeah.
Well, it does sound like a fantastic educational facility, and indeed something very much like the Serpentine. Hugh, your project, it seems to me, your beautiful-looking ribbon, I must say it does look fabulous. It actually changes people's behaviour. I mean, you've made it possible to walk in a city where it is almost impossible to walk. Well, I found that in Miami. Mind you, it's pretty impossible to walk out just right out there too. But tell us about that. I mean, can you actually see behavioural change?
Yes, well, I think, I mean, it's the footfall for the shopping that's obviously is the biggest incidence of that, evidence of that. But I think what's really interesting about that project is, you know, we're talking about accessibility, and I think it's very interesting in the way it blurs the frontier between the commercial, the private, and the public, and invites people to come and live in the space. And it's sort of there's a symbiosis then between the public enjoying being there, hanging around, having a coffee or something, and also the commercial activity, so that they help each other, and I think that's good. But I think the most important thing for me in that is, you know, you ask how, you know, if it's a success, how would one measure that? And I think to see it happening elsewhere in the city, to see more areas becoming sheltered, covered like that, and it's a very generous gesture to have done that. But I think also what's really important is the way the project responds to the environment, and I think that's a responsibility we should also have, you know, with this general question, is that the architecture and the spaces we create should be more responsive to the environment. So this idea of having it collect the breeze and shelter from the sun, I think, is a very important ingredient. I'd love to see that go further.
Do you do a lot of such work? I mean, environmentally adapted buildings. Is that very much part of your practice?
Yes, we do. We're always conscious of the environment, but this one was a real special. We don't get to do climate ribbons every day of the week, which, you know, I'd love to do more, but it is something it's very, very, very conscious about. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing this. Well, maybe a climate ribbon in Kensington Gardens if global warming continues at the same rate. It is a fantastic programme, the Serpentine programme. I think for all of us actually in London, it's been really educational, the pavilions, because I've seen work by architects whose work I didn't know. Because, I mean, you say that China's very, monochrome, as it were, in architectural style, but actually so is Britain. I mean, we've been kind of rubbish, really, about interesting new buildings. On the whole, we've been very cautious. Don't you agree? So this is really something educational.
It's an interesting paradox, you know, because Britain and London have this incredible openness for all art forms, and it's such a, you know, incredible cosmopolitan dialogue also, and open dialogue. But in a strange way, it's, in terms of art above all, it's been very insular in terms of architecture, and that's of course very much the premise of this project of the Serpentine Pavilion. Because the rule of the game is that it is always the first building of the architect in Britain, and that is of course astonishing that Oscar Niemeyer, that Frank Gehry, that Katsuo Sejima and Sana had never built in London or in Britain until the point they designed the Serpentine Pavilion. It's even more astonishing that Zaha Hadid and Rem Koolhaas, who have actually lived for several decades in London, have not built in London until they did the Serpentine Pavilion. I mean, that's almost incredible. But I think the
so
idea...
we were among the people who needed educating, I can tell you. I mean, architecturally, I think we were dinosaurs.
But of course, in a way, that's also changing, you know, and I think in a way the dialogue has opened up a lot. I mean, you know, Mies van der Rohe also never designed, and in London has an unrealized project. But in the last couple of years, more and more international architects did build, which is why we felt very important to go into a younger generation of architects. You know, the scheme, as you could see in the slides I showed, the scheme kind of shifted around 2012 when we started to invite the younger generations. Miljan Radic of Chile, you know, Su Fujimoto from Japan, Sel Gascano from Spain, Bjarke Ingels from Denmark, New York, and now Francis Quéré from Burkina Faso and Berlin. And these architects are architects in their 30s, 40s. It's a very different generation. And that change has also to do that, you know, the basically older generation of architects are more experienced, has more and more had commissions in London and built. But I think one thing which is interesting is that we talk beyond buildings. And I think for us, for example, education is very important. If you think about access, if you think about the impact architecture can have or art can have, education is fundamental. So we started this project supported and in dialogue with Bloomberg Philanthropies and our chairman, Mike Bloomberg, which is build your own pavilion. And the idea is that we invite kids, from all over the place to design their own pavilion. We then have a jury so that it becomes very participatory. And I think this idea of education, this idea of generosity is very important. And you mentioned time. I think also the idea of sustainability is of course important in relation to time. And I think in a way, the project has been going on now for 17 years. The idea is also that the pavilions always find a second home, a third home, so that nothing is thrown away. That they, develop, they go to another city. So we're very interested, so far the pavilions have gone to many destinations in Europe. They've gone to America as well. We're very interested for pavilions also to go to Asia. We're very interested that these pavilions, can have they can generate another community if they go somewhere else. And it's each time, once the pavilion comes down, in front of the gallery and then it's rebuilt somewhere else and we go there, it's fascinating to see what another type of community generates. More recently, we were in Tirana. It's a very interesting place, Albania. Believe it or not, the prime minister is an artist. So this is an artist-run country. Edi Rama, and one of his first acts as prime minister is that he invited the Serpentine Pavilion by Sue Fujimoto, to come for 3 years to Tirana. It's a collaboration with Maya Hoffman and the Luma Foundation, and it's now there. And it's extraordinary, when we spend 24 hours there, day and night, looking at how the pavilion is used, how differently it's used than from London.
Well, there's so much more that I want to ask greedily and selfishly, but I'm conscious of the time, and I'm sure that there are many questions from you, the audience. Would you like to, is there another mic for the audience? Or you can have this one, or you can just shout, whichever. And do say who you would like to put your question to, if there's one of the panelists who you particularly want to ask. I think we've got a question. Oh no, he was just waving. Any questions? Right here. Thank you.
I wanted to ask Hans Ulrich how old the taxi driver's daughter was.
14, 15? Yeah.
Sorry. Because I think you say that access is so important, but I think that educational outreach, she knew about it and she wanted to go, and that made the difference.
Yeah, nothing could stop her, right?
Have we got any? Well, while you're thinking about it, we'll keep going. Another question that I am interested in, I suppose, is about kind of population numbers. I mean, I think that in the various projects we have here, there's a very wide range of what we're looking at in terms of sheer number of people. So obviously, Brendan, the V&A project, there are really, really a lot of people that you're intending to address or work with here, which is very different from perhaps what Shun is doing, building something which is outside a big population centre. Do you think that? Do you think there's sort of maximum, as it were? I mean, it's almost unimaginable in a sense with a teeming Chinese city that you can reach a significant portion of the population.
Right. So your question is essentially, how many people can you reach?
Something along those lines, yes. Or does it make? Obviously, it's going to make a difference. The kind of project that one might do somewhere very populous and somewhere not so populous. But at the same time, maybe you see it more on the kind of set an example and watch it grow model that you were describing before.
Yeah. I see a few curators from M+ Museum here, and when we first started talks about doing. That there would be a design museum in Shenzhen. Most people said, don't you think now you're in competition with M+ and 2 design museums in one region? And then you say, well, there's 45 million people in this region. I think they can handle 2. It's not a big deal. But that question is essentially, the great kind of quantitative versus qualitative question. Like, do you? And I was just having a conversation earlier with our head of press about that. I mean, we talk about audience numbers, and those are great, but audience numbers isn't the be all and end all. And there's a certain kind of, can you get the right people? Can you influence the right people to do things, to make a positive change? That is a much trickier one to answer, and a much trickier one to show to the board members that you're doing positive things. But it's the one that you should really go after. So anecdotally, sometimes you hear stories about somebody who saw a show, and that inspired them to do A, B, or C, and those are the experiences you want to be triggering. And it's not generally about reaching all 45 million people in the PRD, but getting the right people to come, and the people who are going to be inspired and do something with it.
I think museums do better in packs, actually. I think they rather like company. I mean, it's always better to have a few clustered, don't you think? Maybe that's because Hans Ulrich and I both live in a city where we've got an awful lot of them. Actually, you too come to that. Londoners know all that. And I also wanted to ask a question, maybe to any of you would like to answer it. We've talked about the way in which we can improve people's access to art and architecture and design. But if we take the question at a even wider level and think about whether that then goes on to improve their lives in a much wider way, in other words, whether this really has a transformational effect beyond the fact of experiencing. Obviously, you can't quantify what it is to feel that, but I think that's the biggest part of this enormous question that we were set today. And Hansel, you've picked up your microphone, so come on.
No, I think it's a very interesting question, because also, in a way, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we create spaces in cities where people are not obliged or even invited to consume. And I think that this idea of free space is very important. It connects again to access. And if you think about the pavilion, I mean, the Serpentine Pavilion is one of the densest used structures in London you can imagine. I mean, at 5, 6 in the morning, the joggers come, and it's always interesting to see how they use it. I mean, with Frank Gehry, it was a heaven for stretchers, and and every year. Then, of course, the dog walkers. We have a very important, significant, number of visitors are dogs, in Kensington Gardens. So there is a lot of, but then a lot of people just use it to do meetings, impromptu meetings. And for example, the pavilion you saw initially by Rem Koolhaas, he reflected that so that people actually could, in a DIY way, move the furniture around. They could build towers, they could build big sofas, they could do tables, so people came there and 20, 30 people could have a meeting. But you don't have to rent the space, it's free. Of course, there is a possibility to have a coffee if you want. And I think this idea, and then in the evening, people can, it's a meeting spot, and at a certain moment, of course, there are events. And I think this idea that we have spaces also which are not prescribed, where people can, in a very free way, make encounters and in a way find out how to use a structure is very, very important. And to do that, I mean, ideally it would be 24 hours. The park, closes for a couple of hours at night, so then the pavilion is not accessible. But ideally, it's 24 hours. So for example, in Tirana, it's 24 hours access now, the Su Fujimoto Pavilion.
Well, that's that's lovely. That really is build it and they will come. We've got a question here.
I'd like to ask a question about the pavilion in Tirana in comparison to the one in England. How you suggested that people were using it differently in Albania as they do in England, Hans. How is that so? Do you think it's because of the political regime, that it was an ex-communist country, or is the culture just different entirely, or how is it used in that way?
Yes, I think what happened in Tirana is also an enormous density of events that actually a lot of people, because they're in the city, want to use it. Edi Rama told us that they have a huge number of demands of people who just want of all kinds of events. So it became a space which is, I mean, in London there are sometimes events, but we very much so far have wanted people to kind of discover it on their own. We didn't want to sort of organize it too much. And I think there'll be many, many more events. And as I mentioned, we are also changing in this regard, because Jana, Pien and I feel it's very interesting to actually have really communities take over the pavilion, because I think in a way, there is a limit to top-down programming. And if we think about actually art and the soul of the city, London has a night czar now. It's basically a night mayor. Sadiq Khan hired a night mayor. They can't call him or her the night mayor because that would sound too much like nightmare, so it's called the night czar. And it's an extraordinary new position. And we met with, the night czar, she's mapping communities all over London, who actually, occupy and use London at night time. And I was so fascinated by that. So Jana and I feel it's going to be very, very interesting to not do kind of too much top-down programming, but to actually really invite these communities to do something with the pavilion. And I think there is a huge potential for that. I think in terms of institutions to kind of, and this again leads us back to generosity. I think generosity is the key medium for the 21st century, 22nd century.
Do we have another question? Is that one at the back there? Am I allowed to go on? Am I allowed to go on 5 minutes more, since we started 5 minutes late? Is that all right? People can wander off if they don't want to. I think that's a great point about the top down. There's only so much one can do. I think it sounds as if in the Chinese cities in particular, you're thinking about the extraordinary kind of natural talent, as it were, that people will latch onto things and do that sort of thing incredibly fast. And Sean, your artists and others are creating their own projects within your space. So I suppose when I asked my question about how you measure, that was partly what I had in mind. Have you thought about? Do you think about outcomes, as it were, from your projects, or are you just watching it and seeing what's happening?
Like you said, it takes. It takes time, right? So I think what we know is that there's the chance to change people's minds, to change the way they view things, and that's enough for now. That's all we can control. So we don't want to do something that what they sing every day or would do, but something that give them a little bit of stimulus to think about things, to move around, and then to maybe try something new. I think that's all that's enough for now, and whatever happens in the future, we have, yeah.
Can we make that one work too? Because it would be useful. Good. And Hugh, you told me about another project that you actually wanted to talk about, which is a bridge. But you were so obedient to my one city rule that you didn't. So tell us about that one, because that sounded as if it was something that had a very strong communitarian effect.
Yes, but there's actually two bridges I was thinking about. I'm allowed to. Okay, the first one is it's in Turin. We won a competition to do a footbridge to symbolize the Winter Games in 2006 in Turin, and it was to connect the Mercati Generali area of the city to the Lingotto development by Renzo Piano, and the Mercati Generali was a drug addict, terrible place, and a really run-down part of the city. And so I think the idea of the project was to put the Olympic Village, to transform the Mercati Generali into an Olympic Village. And our footbridge was supposed to be a big symbol of this, the symbol of the transformation of this area. And it really does work. The connecting, using the footbridge as a demonstrative, artistic piece of architecture that connects one area to another, literally crossing the bridge, it really does help. And so I think the symbolic value, again, like the climate ribbon, the symbolic value of iconic architecture. It's not just showing off. It often has an appeal that acts as a catalyst for social interactivity. And the other project was a project we did in La Roche-sur-Yon with Bernard Tchoumi, which is a railway bridge connecting two halves of a city. Again, a city cut in half with railway tracks. The bridge is quite a demonstrative piece of structure, an architectural event. It's a trellis tube crossing the tracks. And it too has been a big success, and as a catalyst for social transformation. So bridging literally, and using architectural expression, and not just doing any old bridge, just doing a bridge that actually has a symbolic value, I think can help. So in that way, I think that contributes to the social question.
Well, I believe that we're looking forward to the building of a pretty significant bridge in this city too, so that's going to be quite something. I'm afraid we're out of time. I think we will have to wrap up now because it's such a busy day for everyone. But I hope you'll join me in thanking the panelists so much. I mean, so interesting, all these projects. Thank you, Hans Ulrich, Hugh, Shun, Brendan, thank you.